Okay, so today I'm going to be taking you through my painting process. This will be a watercolor painting, and it's from a photo that I took, which is pictured on the left there on screen, of a pier in Flinders, Victoria, Australia. So I'll be just guiding you through some of my techniques as a watercolor artist. At the moment I'm mixing up my first wash. Now the first wash that I use is a very light mixture. It's barely visible. It's just a mixture mainly of water with a little bit of burnt sienna. The main point of this first wash is to mark out the most important parts of the subject. I don't want to do anything too heavy, and I don't want to do any strong lines at this stage. I just want to keep it as a very faint indication of where to put the next layers. I consciously use watercolor paint to draw in and not pencil. I find that pencil can sometimes stain your washes, and in watercolor the most important thing for me is preserving the light tones, such as the white of the paper and the lightest of tones. And when you use pencil, you can often make these areas very muddy. So yeah, personally I don't use pencil. I prefer using a very faint wash for this part. Now I'm putting in the first wash. This is a wash which is mainly water, which is barely stained with some yellow ochre. Now I'm very conscious at this early stage of the painting to know where my light areas are going to be, which takes a little bit of forethought, because at the end of the painting it's really good if some of these areas still have that initial light tone showing through. You can see that I use an old ice tray to mix my watercolor in. Always try to make sure that I have enough to go over the whole painting. It's good to have the same tone repeated in different parts of the painting. Give your painting a very unified look. Just continuing that same tone through different parts of the painting. Some of this tone, you'll see a bit later on, does get covered, but it might only get covered with one more layer of a faint wash. Do a lot of testing, as you can see. Watercolor dries very differently to when you're putting it on the paper. I often find that when you're putting it on the paper, because it's wet, it always looks darker, and when it dries, it usually dries 1 or 2 shades lighter. So that's why I do testers on the side there, the little swatch. so that I can really gauge what that colour is going to look like when it's dry. This mixture here is a little bit darker, a little bit more pigment. I think it's cobalt turquoise that I'm using. I'll start to sort of carve away at the lighter areas using this darker tone. I try to use the same tone to depict as much of the area of the painting as I can, especially in the early stages of the painting. Even though there's quite a lot of colours in the photograph, I am trying to limit them and portray as many parts of the painting with the one tone. I think this helps to unify the colour scheme of the painting. Being quite tentative here, which is not how I usually like to paint, but I'm just being aware that the boats that are near the pier need to remain very light, if not white. So just taking care to go around those areas. Even if later on in the painting I decide that I want to have them yellow or red, just having that very light or white paper is really crucial at the end of the painting. Really gives the painting pop. So a lot of my work is using flat washes where I create as even a wash as I can without any wet on wet technique. But I do sometimes do wet on wet gradations. So here I'm grading this cobalt turquoise into a raw umber colour, and that's to represent the water going into the sand. This is a wash that's half cobalt turquoise and burnt umber, raw umber. And now I'm using a full raw umber wash. There I'm going around the little beach hut. I think a lot of watercolor artists would probably go right over some of these objects. They'd paint right over them. But going back to what I was saying, I want to always try and limit the layering of washes that I do, because the more layering, um, I think the less vibrant the colours are. So here I'm using the brush to mop up just some of the heaviest drips at the bottom of the wash. Again, it just goes to creating more of a even, flat color color surface. And if you leave areas wet for a long time, they tend to um, make drying marks. Which obviously some painters like those marks. They use them in their process, but I find I just like a more even appearance. So I'm mixing up a green wash now. I think this is cadmium yellow light, Prussian blue, and cadmium red. So we're moving now into sort of the mid light tones. Again, I chose this green as being the lightest colour of this tree section at the bottom of the painting. And I'll cover the entire area, even if it means going over it with slightly darker tones later. While I'm doing this, I'm trying to keep that wet line alive. Keep working it down, bringing it down further and further, not allowing it to dry out too much. Just using the gravity of the drawing board to bring the wash down. Now I'm squeezing out the pigment, and then I'll mop up the bottom of the wash. So I've mixed up a different green now, some more of a darker green, using a bit more of the Prussian blue. I'm thinking that hopefully that wash will be the right tone for the roof of that beach shack. So we've progressed a little further now, and I'm trying to describe the pier in more detail now. So I've mixed up a darker tone, a greyish tone, but it's still a fairly light tone. I'm keeping in mind that the top of the pier is in sunlight, and I don't want to break the tonal values, the tonal areas. So even though there is darkness on top of the pier, it's not a heavy dark. And this colour will dry to a sort of a pale grey. Sort of very gradually creeping my way up to the darker shadows, but very important to do it consciously and not to make it too dark too soon. With watercolour, there is some adjustments, but basically it's a one-way street. You go from your lights to darks, and it can be very tricky to turn backwards and try and undo things. It's not impossible, but it will often make your painting look washed out, or the area that you try to correct will be visibly different. So in general, I try and work my way slowly through the tones so that when I do get to the dark ones, they really stand out, and they're really used to describe the form. I think that's the trickiest thing about watercolours, is getting the tones right, or for me anyway. So often I'll spend quite a lot of time mixing and putting samples down on the swatch and evaluating whether they're the right tone. Sometimes I spend just as much time on that than on the painting. I just noticed that I've blocked in a darker tone on the sea as well. You can see that I've left some areas of that cobalt turquoise to show through. So I've blocked in most of the larger shapes of the painting, and now trying to extract some of the details, some of the pier legs. There's a small van parked on the pier which I'm painting. Even though I am painting in the details, I don't want to paint in details just for the sake of it. I'm trying to find the details which will help the overall painting and not deter from it. So adjusting now here, those light tones that I put in the beginning, that very light yellow ochre tone, is being overlaid with a darker and warmer colour. Now I'm using a fairly heavy dark colour. This would have quite a lot of Prussian blue in it, some cadmium yellow, and also some alizarin crimson to grey it down a bit. So back to what I was saying about not jumping too heavily into the darks. I think I actually did make this a little bit too dark too soon. And a bit later at the end of the painting, you'll see that I try and correct it by washing a mid-tone over that entire tree area. Using a shadow colour as well now to define some of the other areas. And now for some interest, I've decided to include some figures in the composition. I do try and include figures in my landscapes where I think they'll enhance the scene. And in this case, I think the figures give scale to the scene. Give you a bit of a look at how I mix my paint. I end up making quite a lot of wash in the ice tray. That's the swatch. So what I'm doing here is evaluating, standing back and evaluating what areas to adjust. And I decided that the yellow ochre wash that I put at the start wasn't quite strong enough. So I used that swatch to visualize what a slightly darker tone might look like, and now I'm overlaying that wash with that tone. I think it's a good practice, especially towards the end of a painting, to be honest with how you're seeing your own work. Here I'm standing right back, putting the work in the corner of the studio and standing back to get as much perspective as I can. And here's that wash that I mentioned earlier that sort of tempers the darker shadows a little bit, because I felt that they were too extreme. So I'm nearly finished the painting at this stage. The actual image is quite a bit darker than what you see in the video. This last part of the video just shows me putting in some gouache details. I don't use a lot of gouache, but sometimes at the end of a painting where I wouldn't have been able to go around these areas very easily, I do sometimes add a little bit of gouache to bring out some highlights or details. So here's the finished painting. As you can see, it's a little bit darker than what was in the video. Overall, I'm quite happy with the composition. I like how bright the light areas are. I'm happy with the saturation of the colour. And overall, I think it tells the right story. So thanks very much for watching. I'd be keen to hear what your thoughts are about the painting. In particular, I'd like to hear from other watercolour artists to see your thoughts.